Das Erste, was die Leute jetzt hören, ist, wir sind noch nicht live, oder?
Hi and welcome everyone to our 5th UGS web session, and the one I was personally most excited for. I even put on a shirt for the first time in 2 weeks today. My name is Bini Gutmann. I'm the president of the European Union of Jewish Students, the umbrella organization of Jewish unions in 36 European countries, the democratic peer-led representation of around 160,000 young Jews.
Hi everyone, my name is Anna. I'm 21 years old and I'm studying art history and French language. And today I'm really honored to represent the Jewish Student Union of Germany. And yeah.
We are very happy to welcome today Sergey Lagodinsky, who is a member of the European Parliament for the European Greens. He's the chair of the delegation to the EU Turkey, to Turkey. And the vice chair of the Committee on Legal Affairs and the vice chair of the European Parliament's Working Group on Combating Anti-Semitism. Sergey, thanks a lot for coming on. How are you in these challenging times?
Thank you. That's the most important question nowadays. Yes, I'm fine, and I hope that most of the people watching us are fine. Thank you for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to work with you.
And most importantly, Sergey is a great friend of UGS, so really thanks for coming on. The way that this is going to go today is that we are going to start with a little game that Sergey agreed to play with us, that Anna is going to explain to you soon. After that, Anna and I are going to ask Sergey some questions, and then it's your turn, dear audience, to ask Sergey your questions. So if you have any questions, you can submit them on Facebook Live, you can submit them on Zoom, and you can also submit them via email to office@ugs.org. Everything is fine, and we will ask Sergey those questions a little bit later in the conversation. But let's jump right into it, Anna.
All right. Before we begin, we would like to do kind of a little icebreaker with you, Sergey, and it's gonna work the following way. We are going to tell you names of famous figures from the Jewish history, and you have to assign famous persons from nowadays politics to those figures. So the first name we would like to give you is Vashti.
I would say probably Miss von der Leyen under current circumstances.
That's a good answer.
A very risky situation and risky position.
Yeah.
Let's hope that you will like Vashti. Esther, King Esther, Queen Esther.
Well, gender is is a continuous concept, so it can be just as well a King Esther. Maybe Miss Jourova, the Justice Commissioner, in confronting Mr. Orban, who would be Haman nowadays, especially considering his plans to basically become the little king of Hungary as of next week.
Okay, cool. We wanted to ask you also who's Haman. Now you already answered this.
And
I'm trying to shorten this period of humiliation for me.
Perfect. But what about King David?
Oh, that's a tough one. King David. Well, that's difficult. Let's hope. Why not Miss Merkel? Someone who, despite all political different preferences, I do respect very much, and by the way, wish her not to get sick. She's in quarantine currently, but someone who is probably able with steady hand to hold Europe together. At least this is my hope. So let's bet on her.
And last but certainly not least, Moses.
Who's going to lead us out of this desert? My God. Well, definitely not Mr. Putin or someone like this, even though he's trying to. Moses. I would say probably each and everyone. We need kind of a conglomerate of Moseses because we don't need one leader. And you see it in a situation like this today. Everyone has responsibility. It depends on each one of us. And I would bet on little Moses in each and every one of us.
I think that's a very good point to end, and you successfully turned this game into a serious, into some serious topics. So thanks for being a good sport. So let's now turn to the more serious part of this conversation, and gets to ask you questions, dear audience, if you have some.
Yeah, the first question that we would like to ask you is, we think it would be really interesting to hear about your personal and political journey into the European Parliament. I mean, the way from Jewish community work to the European Parliament. How did you get there? Which challenges did you face? And especially also, what role did your Jewish identity play within this process?
Well, that's interesting. I think that maybe I'll start with the last one. What role does the Jewish identity play in this? I think it was an additional motivator. I think that for someone living in Europe today, belonging to a minority to begin with, being an immigrant, but also being part of a minority which used to be an integral part of this whole society and continent, who played an important role, and now, if we're honest, doesn't play much of a role at all. I think it kind of like makes you stubborn and motivated, and you want to show that that the Jewish voices are here, and that they are also voices which can intellectually and politically stimulate the debate in our societies. If we look at each other, we're always a little bit maybe thinking out of the box, and maybe also uncomfortable for our societies. We break out of the mainstream also in our parties and speak out very often. And sometimes we cannot stop speaking out, which is also a problem in itself. But I think it's partly also because of this wish and need to fill this void, which we will never be able to fill, of the people who are absent, who were killed and murdered. And I think that if I can go a little bit deeper, and this is a motivator as well. But of course, and I will end with this, I don't want to give too long answers. The other thing is that experiencing ourselves as a minority, as a vulnerable minority in a society, makes you wonder how other minorities feel. It makes you also cherish the freedoms and the liberties that we have to self-fulfill ourselves and to unfold ourselves as a minority, but also as an individual. And for me personally, this was the biggest trigger. Try to keep this society with the freedoms and the democracies that we have, but also try to develop it so that more and more people can participate and can enjoy the liberties that we have or had as of last week or 2 weeks ago.
Thank you for sharing this with us. But can you also tell us something about your way and the experiences you made on this way, from being an active part of a Jewish community to going into politics, and how did this all work? I guess it would be really interesting for all of us to hear.
Well, I started, I came in 1993. Most of your participants weren't probably even born then. And we came as a Jewish family from Russia, from the former Soviet Union. And of course, the first point of departure or of arrival were Jewish communities. We were alone. We didn't speak the language. We couldn't orient ourselves in this new society, and we went to the Jewish community. And actually, the first steps that we made there was also to establish ourselves as actors, as someone who is not just being taken care of. And so for me, it was an important part, and Bini and others, we already talked about this, is kind of growing and leaving the role of an object and becoming a subject, a political maker, a political doer, right? A macher. This is something that probably started within the Jewish community. I was active in the Jewish community of Kassel for a long period of time. Then I moved to the United States and came back to Berlin, where I became also a member of the community. And the 12 years that I spent in the Berlin Jewish politics were very formative for me, because it showed to me several things. One thing, how important our democracies and democratic freedoms are, even for the Jewish community life. This is something that people who know the situation in the Jewish community of Berlin know, that this was a constant struggle. Also against something that I would say call a little bit maybe pejoratively a post-Soviet mentality, which is also quite spread in our communities, trying to say, you know, we should cherish our roots, also our post-Soviet or Soviet past. And I really fight and fought for example, recognition of the May 9th, you know, like as a victory day. By that, at that point, it was not manipulated by Putin. At that point, it was a day which everyone celebrated, and recognizing the lives and the professional lives of our people in Russia. Also recognizing our Jewish identities, which were not religious, those were ethnic or cultural identities, but those were identities that people grew up with and lived with, and they were not recognized here in the communities right away. So there was this struggle, and at the same time, it was important for me to self-reflect and to say, what are the problematic features of the post-Soviet mentality that we're bringing? How can we combat this, that we don't have kind of a populist type authoritarian way of thinking when it is about building community life and community structures. And this is something that I was able to live through the 12 years when I was member of the parliament in the Jewish community of Berlin. It was not an easy piece of cake, and there was a lot of you know, sobering effect connected to that, but it made me stronger, because I also learned how to work in a political environment, which we don't have, if we're honest, everywhere in Germany. It's basically an authoritarian little regime within the Jewish community of Berlin, and you're trying to fight, and you're trying to resist the temptation of fighting and screaming and scolding at each other, and you endure the humiliation, and they try to give an answer and a reply which is not about screaming, but is about moving things forward. So I think that this is something, and this is the second part of it, that I also took with me from my life within the Jewish community. And there is one more thing, and this is number 3, and then I'm done, is the spirit of community. I think that this is something that we, especially now during this virus days, the COVID days, sense that the society as a whole, and even the most individualistic societies, realize how important it is to be part of something, not in the sense of submitting ourselves to the majorities or to groups, or letting the groups dictate how every individual should be, but calculating and informing our decisions and our way of doing things by solidarity with others around you. And this is, I think this is something which is very Jewish, because if you grow up in the Jewish community, you learn this. And I hope that we are able to bring this attitude to this new, very difficult, very complicated world, especially these weeks, without destroying at the same time the individualistic freedom that we have as a liberal democracy. And this is also something that I learned.
Thanks a lot, and I really think that a lot of the things that you just said really resonate with a lot of us and a lot of us in the audience, because these are issues that we are encountering every day. And this is part of the work that the German Union is doing, that we as UG is on the one hand trying to democratize Jewish communities and trying to make sure that Jewish communities actually look the way they should, that we look the way that that their constituents look like. And I can tell you from experience that this is not only an experience that is true in Berlin, but rather in a lot of Jewish communities. So I think it's quite important to mention that. And additionally, we are also trying to politicize young Jews. We think that the part of the answer, part of the fight for both Jewish rights and for human rights is to politicize young Jews and to bring young Jews actually into politics. And this is the most effective ways. So seeing you as kind of a role model, I think is really important for especially young Jews in Germany. And that actually brings me to the next question, which I just saw was also asked already from someone in the audience, relating to your work in the European Parliament, and more specifically as the Vice Chair of the European Parliament's Working Group Against Anti-Semitism. Could you tell us a little bit more about your work in the working group and why you think that this work is important in the European Parliament?
Yeah, I mean, we have to be fair to the working group itself, and we have to understand that the work of the working group is a little bit different than the work of an NGO, for example, because many people tell me, you know, you should, why don't you go and take care of this event or this anti-Semitic accident or that? We are a parliamentary body, and I understand our work as watching the situation closely, also in member states, but more importantly, bringing the concerns and the perspectives which are sensitized by this fight against anti-Semitism to the parliament and to the parliamentary space. And this in itself is hard enough, because I think, I mean, first of all, we have so many complex topics on the plate that it's very difficult, and I don't blame anyone, that people from Hungary or from, you know, my colleagues from Greece, they have other things on the plate. But it is important to remind them that anti-Semitism is part of this complex situation. And any situation like this, if you look at Greece, if you look at Hungary, if you look at the situation now with COVID, you will always find components which have something to do with anti-Semitic mindset, with conspiracy theory mindset. Because anti-Semitism is not just a stereotype, it's a worldview. It's an outlook on how our world is built, who is responsible and who is to blame, basically. And so you see how complex it is. And I understand our working group as a kind of a reminder to everyone in the parliament that one part of this puzzle, of this very complex puzzle, is also our dealing with this sentiment of anti-Semitism. So what do we do exactly? I mean, for example, we wrote a letter on the situation on the Carnival of Aalst, which took place in February, something that only the media looked at for many months and years, but there were no voices from Parliament, especially from the European Parliament, which is just 20 kilometers or 40, I think 40 kilometers away from this place, who would say, I'm sorry, but this is not okay. This is not the European way of celebrating or making fun. So for example, something like this, but also assisting and kind of a parliament from framing it from parliamentary side, the work of, for example, Katharina von Schnurbein, who is the Special Commissioner against Anti-Semitism within the Commission, and assisting her in, for example, overviewing the implementation of the Council resolution on anti-Semitism, something that all states said in 2018, and they celebrated themselves. And the question is now, what actually happened with this? Did you actually implement what you promised? And this was one of my personal goals. Also, when I spoke with Katharina von Schnurbein, to start looking individually at certain member countries and talk to our colleagues from member countries, asking them what actually happened with the implementation of this council resolution, because the resolution itself is very good. The question is, as always, what relevance will it have in normal policy making.
Thanks a lot. On that note, a trend that we see more and more, I think both in the student world, but also in politics more broadly, is the politicization of the fight against anti-Semitism. Meaning that you have forces, especially on the far right now, but also on the far left, that only fight anti-Semitism that is politically opportune to them and kind of use anti-Semitism to distract from other issues and problems that they have. You see a lot of parties on the far right and on the extreme right using the fight against anti-Semitism, which in their eyes only comes from the Muslim side, to kind of cushion themselves, to whitewash their racism. And we in the Jewish student world, I think in most of Europe, see this as one of the most dangerous developments. Also, when you have forces on the far left who only see far right anti-Semitism, which is of course also too short. What do you think we can do to counter these trends while at the same time effectively combating anti-Semitism?
I think it's important to be intellectually and politically honest, and not to let ourselves being instrumentalized by anyone. I usually say, you know, I started talking about the situation around kind of not conventional, not mainstream understanding of anti-Semitism in 2004, 2003, when I started working with the American Jewish Committee in Germany. And actually the OSCE, first OSCE conference on anti-Semitism, we organized and coordinated an NGO event there. And that's the first time after Durban, the Durban conference on anti-racism, when they started talking about in how much anti-racism movement, so basically a left-leaning identity politics, as they would call it today, is also part of the equation, and also is something that has certain features that are anti-Semitic. But also, what about people from other countries? Because in Germany especially, and I wrote my whole PhD on that, we are very fixated on Nazi forms of anti-Semitism, kind of the NS, National Socialism forms of anti-Semitism. But anti-Semitism is a very diverse phenomenon. And we have to start looking also on other forms, or forms which are brought from the region of Near East conflict, for example, etc., etc. And this is something that in 2003 nobody wanted really to talk about. We had kind of our little circus of NGOs who agreed with us. Some of them are very prominent now, like Kreuzberg Initiative Against Anti-Semitism, doing a great job. We supported them at that time. And I think that what I learned from that process is you can talk about everything. I don't agree with the populist mantra saying, you know, you cannot talk about anything. I can talk, and I talk about everything, as long as you have a certain kind of street credibility, that you will address all shadings of anti-Semitism, and you will address all forms of hatred, and you will not just be focused on you know, branding other minorities for being perfect anti-Semites, but also sometimes speak for rights of other minorities. So I think it's a process, and in many cases it's a personal process, because it's very often about personal credibility. And so for me, it's no problem to talk about anti-Semitism among migrant groups, Muslim, but also not Muslim, because I know for myself that if those groups need my support and my solidarity themselves, then I will be in the first row to march for them and to protect them. At least this is what I'm telling myself. I hope that people agree with it. So it's also about kind of an inner compass, inner, you know, some orientation within you, which gives you anchor and allows you to say things that maybe some people don't like, but you know that these are things that you really care about, and there are people that you really care about, not just some concepts and not just some instrumental things, but it is about safety of people, it is about life of people, and it's about a world with as little hatred. I don't believe in a world without hatred, unfortunately. I'm old enough to say that this is probably not very realistic, but a world with as little hatred and harm from it as possible.
I think this is quite a good segue to the next question, actually. A world without hatred, or with little hatred as possible. What has been most striking to a lot of us with the current situation with the coronavirus in all of Europe is actually the lack of solidarity that you can see in big parts of Europe, and especially between European countries. And a few examples for that. On the one hand, there are still tens of thousands of refugees in inhumane conditions, refugee camps in Greece without any access to healthcare, being left in the cold and facing corona without any help from anyone. And we have completely forgotten about them. At the same time, we saw these stories, especially yesterday, of some EU countries actually holding up masks that were meant for Italy. And of course, and maybe most dangerously, we see Viktor Orban, you've mentioned that already, really transforming Hungary into an authoritarian state. And the question that we're really asking ourselves is, where is the European Union in all of that?
Well, this is the question that we're asking ourselves as well. I mean, first of all, it's important to see that this is now the first addressee and the first actor in situations like this is always the executive power. Parliamentarians can only later, I would say, starting this week, next week, start reacting to that, because in a crisis, executive powers is the most important. I do think, though, that a lot of European Union actions, they can be more, but there are already now starting European actions, also in terms of solidarity, in terms of helping, sorry, in terms of helping, for example, Italy, in terms of at least trying to coordinate things in a crisis. And I would say that, of course, it is very unfortunate that we started thinking nationally through this crisis, because, and it's not about ideology, it's not because I come from the European Union or from European Parliament that I'm like, yeah, you have to think European in the European way all the time, no matter what. No, I think that the solutions for this crisis are not national, because what's going to happen after 2 weeks of national quarantines, or 4 weeks, or 3 months of us, we at some point we have to open borders. Even now we need open borders for goods and for strategic goods, etc. So, but the first reaction was very nationalist, and now in the aftermath we're trying to kind of mend the situation. For example, the border between Germany and Poland was basically, it was dysfunctional for many days, and it's also a problem for goods and for the strategic goods that we need. So I do think, and this is our point, is that we should use this moment as a moment of strength, not the weakness for European cooperation, and we're working on this. But nevertheless, two more things that I wanted to mention to you. There is lack of solidarity, and it should be balanced out now. But there is also lack of transparency and communication about things that do take place. And this is something that we should be careful about, because there are certain foreign actors like China, Russia, who are unfortunately using this crisis for, and I would say, kind of political PR, global geopolitical PR games. And I'm talking here about the help and the aid that the Chinese are doing now, and branding it, and the Russians as well, branding it purposefully as a proof for the fact that Europeans are weak that Europeans are not able to help themselves, and only them, the authoritarian regimes, are those who are capable of acting under pressure. And this is something that I think we should be careful not to get into this trap. So the conclusions that I draw from this is, number one, we do need real solidarity. We do need strengthened acts like, for example, we're doing now in Baden-Württemberg in Germany, where the hospitals are being opened for French victims. I heard that Saxonia is now starting to accept to fly in sick people from Italy. We need more of this, of course, understanding that we ourselves are in a precarious situation, but we need to get our act together, and only then we will not be blamed for being inactive, and others will be able to use this momentum to kind of play this competition of systems, and saying, because it's very easy now to say, you see, authoritarian system works. Yes, in crisis at the beginning, certain authoritarian systems work. For example, the Chinese example. I'm not sure about the Russian example, because in Russia we are on the verge of a crisis which is totally uncontrolled and uncontrollable. And Russia, by suppressing information about, because now they're saying, we have pneumonia, so many pneumonia cases now, but we don't have coronavirus because we're Russians. But this is not true, we know. So there will be a big crisis in Russia upcoming as well. I would not put the Orban situation in the same category. Orban's actions are not lack of solidarity. Orban's actions are lack of democratic spirit. And this is a different game. And there we have to push back. And we are pushing back on other occasions. And I do hope very much that the plans that his government is pushing for the next week will not materialize. And there we need a strong European voice from Brussels against this.
But is there like a certain strategy to handle Hungary right now, to work with Hungary, or what are the next actions to expect from the EU?
Well, I would, there is not so much, I mean, even in the peace times, we don't have a real strategy in dealing with Orban, right? Because we have those instruments, we have Article 7 procedure going on, but Article 7 procedure, I deal with this as well quite often, frequently, is a very difficult procedure, because at the end, it's up to the governments themselves to decide whether they're going to be punished, they're going to punish themselves or not. And, Poland helps Hungary, Hungary helps Poland, a couple of other countries, the Czech Republic helps both of them. So, and then they don't have enough votes to actually act on something. I think that we need a more clear stance of our conservative friends and partners of the European People's Party. We need, because the People's Party, so CDU, Merkel, etc., and Orban sit in the same group in the parliament, in the European Parliament. They are member of the same political family. And for now, it stayed like this. But at this particular moment of history, I think it's important that the European People's Party will tell Orban, if this thing is enacted next week that you are planning to do, then it's the end of game. And you are not a member of a democratic family anymore, because basically what is happening there is the is the end of democracy. It's not even they weren't able to agree that there will be a phasing out of the process that they're starting now. It's not okay. It's not part of the European way of life. But yes, I mean, your question implicitly shows to us it's very difficult to have a coherent strategy vis-a-vis authoritarian governments within the European Union. We're trying everything, but it's not that easy.
All right, thank you. Maybe one last question. It's also not an easy one, but nonetheless, what do you think? how does the EU look like in 20 years when we talk about the European vision? And yeah, what's the goal? What do you hope for?
You know, it's so nice to get your questions because they are so COVID free. You know, it's like as if we didn't have the end of the world coming in 2 weeks. We're
That is
talking
the
about
idea.
the world in 20 years. No, but
that is the idea of the web session series, to actually have content beyond COVID. We think that's quite.
Yeah, I agree, absolutely.
Yeah, it's about forgetting what's going on outside.
Yeah, I'm sorry I mentioned it a couple of times. Now I realize that I actually broke your.
We'll cut it from the finished stream.
I mean, I do hope that in 20 years we have. You know, I'm not an ideologue in that sense. It's not about whether we will have a confederation or federation or whatever you name it. It's about a society or a union where solidarity, something that we're desperately lacking now, is the basis, where it is clear to people that, I mean, first of all, I hope it will be a beacon of wealth and liberty. But I do hope that this wealth and liberty will be based on what we do the best, and it is when we cooperate. Europe is a cooperative game. Europe is not a competition game and an isolation game. And I think that in 20 years, if we get to the point where this is something that is natural to us as Europeans, that we only get forward also worldwide if we work together, then we already have accomplished something.
Thanks a lot, and let's now go to the audience questions. So if you have any more questions, please ask them now. And although we've received a lot of questions already, and we won't be able, I think, to answer all your questions, but we will try our best.
So the first question is, what are your positions on the situation in Israel right now, and what is the role of the EU in a two-state solution?
What is my position on Israel? On Israel?
Yeah, on Israel.
In the current situation.
Moment. Yeah, okay. The current situation in Israel right now. And what do you think is the role of the EU in a two-state solution?
And I think we should be careful in differentiating between the domestic situation in Israel and the situation, the international situation in Israel. Regarding the domestic situation, I think I am very concerned about, and you know, I feel kind of part of the larger extended family because part of my family lives in Israel. I'm very concerned about the kind of the populist twist that we are, the authoritarian twist that we're experiencing in the Israeli policies and politics. And I'm not supposed to talk about COVID, but you know what's happening now.
Fine in this context, I think.
So that there, I hope and I pray and that the strengths of Israel that actually characterize this domestic politics for the past decades, a vibrant democracy with people shouting at each other, but by shouting at each other, moving on the democratic standards in the country. I hope that this will survive, and we should do everything which is possible to support it. Regarding the two-state solution, the question, I don't see an alternative to the two-state solution. I'm not a proponent of a one-state, which would be Jewish. I mean, this is not going to work for obvious reasons. I think many people understand and know this and share this. I do think that no matter how hard the situation on the way to the two-state solution can be, we should work on this. I do think that it will involve evacuation some of the settlements. I don't think that the right way to get there is is annexation. And this is not my position as a foreigner. It's the position of the Israeli Constitutional Court. This is a benevolent occupation according to the Israeli Constitutional Court, and there is not a big betrayal in pronouncing it. Whether it's justified or not is a different question. Yeah, I think in certain situations you don't have a choice but occupy. But at some point, occupation has to stop. And so I think looking for ways of how to stop this occupation in order to allow a democratic Jewish state in the future, as one of the two states, we have to continue fighting. And I think that the Trump initiative was not helpful at all for this progress.
Thank you for this. We're going to stay in the Middle East, and the next question is how to deal with Iran.
I can repeat my last question, my last sentence. I don't think that the Trump solution on that issue either is the right solution. And I know that this is not a position that many, that some Jewish people and Jewish friends would share, but I don't think that we can deal with Iran in the way that the President Trump is dealing with Iran, and especially since we had an agreement, and this agreement was not perfect, and I understand and I shared most of the criticism regarding this agreement, but this was an agreement. There was something, some progress going on. I don't see an alternative, just as I don't see an alternative to a two-state solution. I don't see an alternative, a viable alternative to the agreement that we had. And that's why I'm concerned, because it doesn't bring us anything to escalate the situation. We will not be able to. Ever since the Iraq War, I'm skeptical about kind of a very optimistic regime change scenarios. We have seen that it can go wrong. And therefore, anything that we demand also in that area, we need to provide viable alternatives before we kill the regime, the norms and the agreements that are on the table. This is something that I say in domestic politics. I say this to my green friends on many issues where I think there is too much, ideological rejection. Well, okay, tell us what is the alternative. So tell me what is the alternative for Iran in dealing with Iran, as opposed to the agreement that we have. And if this alternative is viable, let's go for it. I don't see an alternative so far.
Maybe another question, because we got actually 2 or 3 questions on Iran, interestingly enough, and one of them was on how European politicians, and more specifically Claudia Roth from your party, who has apparently a number of pictures with the Iranian leadership, but more broadly, how European politicians should deal with the regime in Iran, and how friendly we should be, how normalized relations should be with Iran, and how in general we should deal with the dictatorships like Iran.
Well, my point on
beyond the nuclear deal.
I'm sorry?
Beyond the nuclear deal.
My point on dictatorship is always and has always been clear. And actually, to be honest, when I was in even in the Social Democratic Party before, I remember us protesting against any attempts to normalize relations with Iran. But there is a difference between normalizing relations and asking for war. I'm not someone who is hesitant in using. I'm not someone who wants to de-escalate any situation and conflict, any tension. I think that escalation sometimes is important. You cannot. You have to be able to confront your adversaries and to project power also in the confrontation. But you have to be wise in doing so. And I don't think that just shaking hands, someone who is present, makes you an appeaser. I don't know what Claudia Roth's mentioning. There are a lot of fakes also which are distributed, but there is this handshake or whatever she did with this mullah who was present. Well, maybe I wouldn't have done this, but to be honest, I'm a big opponent of Mr. Putin and also a big critic of Mr. Erdogan. But if I am in the room with either of them, I don't think I'm not going to shake their hands or something. It's a diplomatic game we're playing. I'm the chair of the EU-Turkey delegation of the European Parliament. I'm very outspoken on criticizing the rollback of human rights in this country, and still I go to that country. I meet with all groups of the parliament. I talk to them because I am representing the diversity of European voices. And I think this we should understand that politics and diplomacy is a very complicated game, and you cannot have the same standards for them as for me as a person. I wouldn't like to shake hands to any dictator, but at a certain point you have a position where you have to do this. In any case, I think shaking hands is not the biggest problem. Appeasing someone and forgetting about human rights violations is the big problem, and that we should mention. And this is the criminal nature of the Iranian regime, and it should be confronted again and again and again. The question that we have is the question that we have with everyone. Me criticizing Putin again and again and again does not change anything on the ground. That's the problem. Me criticizing Iran again and again and again does not change much on the ground. So this is not kind of a situation, the question with Iran. This is the problem of limitations of our politics today. And this is something that really causes sleepless nights for me, because I'm responsible for politics vis-a-vis Putin and vis-a-vis Erdogan, and I see how that we don't have enough instruments and levers to actually do something, right? One would be to have economic pressure, and that's what we're doing or sanctions that we're doing with Russia and with Turkey to a certain degree. And I would agree that we should do the same with Iran. But it's a complicated game geopolitically.
Thanks a lot. We unfortunately have to move on because we're almost running out of time. And now actually for the last audience question, for which we have time, we're actually gonna talk about Corona a little bit. Very current and timely question. I also think a very interesting question. So I think it's worth breaking our promise not to speak about Corona. So someone asked, low-income households are more affected by this crisis than people who can work from home and or have more financial means. Do you think that the current situation will have a lasting change in the economy and its role in society in terms of class structure?
I think that the consequences of this crisis, we can not. It's difficult to overestimate them. They will be huge. They are psychological. They are in terms of globalization. What does it mean for our globalized world, for the chains, the production chains that we're having, which is kind of like spun all over the world. There will be a big moment of mistrust and distrust towards free market capitalism and globalization. And some of this mistrust is justified, but some of this, and we should be careful about that, will be driven by emotions of people who are under pressure and who are in crisis. And I think that the role for politicians, but also for any leaders like yourself, is to try to navigate in this very difficult situation, to acknowledge people's sufferings and problems, but at the same time to be able to tell them, to give them comfort, but also give them a larger perspective of their demands and the consequences that there would be. So I do think that there will be structural changes probably in our society after this, just because a lot of wealth will be reshuffled. Look at the stock market going on, how much wealth has been destroyed just within a week. And these are companies. This is something that someone owned it. So there will be a lot of reshuffling, and at the same time there will be new actors coming into play. Probably the state. Very often, you know, Macron is also now talking about more state interventions, but many companies will not survive without them having been nationalized, especially the structurally important companies. I hope that we will draw the right conclusions from that. We need to think about sustainable. I mean, this crisis shows that the result of us not thinking in a sustainable way, not thinking in 2 or 3 steps. We enjoyed the momentum, right? And we did not think what happens when these chains and the production chains, the nature does not play with us, does not play along. And this is something that will be changing. Whether we will have new classes, I don't know, but there will be new actors politically and geopolitically as well.
Thank you for answering all of our questions. Now, unfortunately, we have to come to an end, and we would like to end this session with rapid fire questions that we prepared. We are asking you questions which you have to answer in 1 or 2 sentences. And the first one is, what was your most surprising experience in the European Parliament? Oh
God, it has to be short, right?
Yeah, that's already too long.
It's difficult for me to say something short. My most surprising in the European Parliament, the very modest offices in Strasbourg.
Now it gets a little bit more spicy. Who's your favorite MEP and why?
My favorite MEP, my God. Maybe I'm not gonna offend all my colleagues, but I think one of the most interesting MEPs, I think, is Terry Reinke, for example, a Green MEP from our group, who's really a real character, someone where the emotions and the brain work together. And by the way, someone who's very a good ally on many issues of Jewish student organizations and other Jewish organizations. I really like to work with her, and yeah, I enjoy it very much.
I absolutely agree. Terry Reinke is also a great friend of UGS, so I absolutely agree.
But who's your least favorite MEP?
Well, I have the whole group of them. I am a little bit annoyed by our ID friends. For those who don't know, ID is not identification document. ID is identity and democracy. This is the group of the populists, where IFD is also part of. And I'm quite honestly a little bit annoyed by their attempts to instrumentalize issues of anti-Semitism again and again and again in our work, just to take one example.
Who's your dream dinner guest, either from someone who's alive today or someone from the past?
I would sit down and have a dinner with George Soros. Not because I'm like and you know, I know about the weaknesses, etc. But I think as a character, as a personality, as a Jewish voice, is someone who is fascinating, and I would like to know more about him and his life.
I'd love to join that dinner.
Me too.
Okay, organize it.
How many coffee do you drink in a day?
How many coffees?
Yeah. How many
Not more than 2, because I'm actually a tea person. but I've become a coffee person when I started working in offices, and sometimes you cannot survive without it.
Yeah, I understand.
And lastly, who was or is your political role model?
Oh God, your questions. I don't, to be honest, I have so many people I look up to, but they have all their weaknesses. So I don't do, I mean, I could say Obama, but I was so angry at Obama at the end of his term by his style and his way of portraying. So maybe Obama at the first part, during his first electoral campaign, this would be my role model.
Thank you very much. I think this concludes our session. Thank you very much, Anna, for joining, and thank you very much, Sergey, for also joining and also for being such a good sport and playing some games with us. Very much appreciated. Normally in UGS tradition, we would now give you a piece of chocolate. Yes,
you can send it.
Yeah, this is a good idea. So we might send it to you, or the next time we see each other when COVID is over. But this concludes otherwise our session. We have daily web sessions each day, most days at 6:30. So check them out on our Facebook. And most importantly, stay at home and have a good evening.
Stay at home and all the best. Thank you so much. And greetings to everyone who watched us.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Bye-bye.